Up to this point, nearly all the graphics that we're using inside of our website are images. In this chapter, we're going to find out how we can make our own graphics using HTML and JavaScript. And it starts with the canvas tag. So let's open up a file that we can work with. I've already got my working files open to the Chapter 6 folder for HTML5 graphics. And I'm just going to open up the first file here, try canvas. And as usual, I'm going to open it up in Firefox. And we'll also open it up in our text application so that we can edit it. Now this file really doesn't have much going on with it. It just has a simple h1 tag. But what we're going to be doing is we're going to be adding the canvas tag, which is the root of everything that we're going to be building on top of in this graphics section. It starts off just like a normal tag. So I'm just going to put in here canvas. And it does have a close tag as well. Generally, what we're going to put inside of this tag is a message to users who can't see the canvas because their browser doesn't support it. And I'll just put something in here like, your browser cannot support canvas graphics. Now, since we're testing this out on a browser that does support canvas graphics, you shouldn't see this message at all. Our canvas is going to need a couple of items in order to set itself up right. And just like any other block tag, it's going to need a width and a height. And since we're going to be working with JavaScript, we're going to add an ID with it as well. So let's go ahead and add those elements. I'll just go right inside the starting canvas tag. We'll set up an ID first. And I'll just set that equal to test canvas. And so we have some place to work with. I'm going to add in a width and height of 300 pixels. Now, canvas is a pretty good name for this tag because just like a real painting canvas, this one is blank until we put something onto it. And the thing that's going to do that for us is JavaScript. So what I'm going to do next, so we can see our canvas, is let's put something on it. I need to set up our JavaScript. So we'll go down to the bottom of the document. And generally, this is a good place to collect up your JavaScript elements. I'm going to put a script tag right here before the close body statement, so that's the last thing on the page. Now I'll go ahead and put in a close script tag. And inside of this script tag, we want to set up a couple of JavaScript elements that we haven't had an opportunity to use yet. So let's introduce them as we set up our canvas tag. First, I want my JavaScript to load immediately as soon as the page is ready. Now up to this point, we've been using a lot of JavaScript, but we've been testing it on a local browser, so everything's worked kind of fine. The way a browser interprets the page is it reads from top to bottom. So one of the things we do is put our script at the bottom, and we can make sure that most of the elements will be loaded up and ready to go by the time it gets to the script. But for some instances, we want to make sure that the page is loaded. So for that, we're going to set up an event and a function to handle the event. You'll probably see this a lot if you look at other people's JavaScripts, because it's very typical to wait for the page to load and get a signal that it's all loaded from JavaScript before we start executing things. It all happens pretty fast, so it won't slow things down. And here's how it looks. I'll go into my script tag, and the very first thing I'm going to do is use a window.onload statement. Window is, of course, our browser window, and onload is the event that says the page is finally finished loading. So when the onload event fires off for the page, we're ready to work on all the elements of the page. Now I said I was going to set up a function, so we're going to set this equal to, we'll call a generic function. When we do this, we don't have to give it a name or anything. And of course, all functions have parentheses. And since we're defining this function is also going to have an open brace, and then we'll go down a couple lines and I'll put in a close brace. And inside there, I can put whatever I want JavaScript to be executing right when the page finishes loading. Now, in order to work with our canvas, we need to do two things right off the bat. We need to find the canvas element that we want to work on, and then we need to instruct JavaScript to look for what's called the context, or basically the contents of that canvas. That'll open the canvas up and get it ready for us to put things on it. Now, that's going to be 2 lines of code. I'm going to set up a variable, and I'll just call it canvas for right now. And we'll set that equal to the canvas element itself by using a document.getElementById to find it. So let's put that in. Now, of course, we're going to use the ID we gave our canvas element to identify it, and that's test canvas right here. So I'll just go ahead and put that into my function call. Now, our next line of JavaScript is going to get the context, or what we call the contents, of that canvas. So what I'm going to do is make another variable called context, and we'll set that equal to our canvas that we just created in the previous line. and we'll call the getContext function. That'll be used in conjunction with any kind of canvas element. Now, this function does have a parameter we need to add to it. We're going to ask it for the 2D context. Now, that implies that there's a lot more to come with this graphics, but we're only going to be working with the 2D objects for right now. I'll close off that line, and now what we've done is we have identified our canvas and stored that into a variable, and then we've identified the context of the canvas, and we've also stored that into a variable. Now, I did want to add something else that we see a lot in JavaScript, and that is a special keyword for creating variables. I'm going to put it right at the beginning of these two statements, and it's var, V-A-R. Now, that's kind of short for a variable, and it's a more official way to make a JavaScript variable, but it does something very specific for us. Whenever we're creating variables, we can use them just about anywhere, but when we use the var keyword to create a variable, we can only use the variable where it was created. And in this case, these two variables here would only be good inside this function. Now, that's important for JavaScript because we might have a lot of variables, especially if we're getting scripts from other people. And we want to make sure that our variables and our functions don't mess around with their variables and their functions. So it's a good practice to go ahead and use the var keyword when you're creating variables, and it also makes it easier to identify the line where you're creating your variables because it always has a var in front of it. Now we've got everything ready to actually draw something into our canvas. And I just want to point out that with any canvas element that we're going to be working with, we need to define the canvas, give it a width and height, and an ID, and then we need to set up a function that will find that canvas for JavaScript for us using getElementById, and also find the context of that. And we'll have to do that before we do anything with our canvas elements in the future. Now it's time to draw something. So I'm going to try the easiest thing. We're just going to draw a rectangle. First, I'm going to call off the context. And we're going to use that element to be able to do all of our drawing functions for us. For our first example, I'm just going to use a really simple function, rect. And as you could probably guess, that makes a rectangle. Now we need to give it some coordinates. I need to give it the upper left coordinate for x and y. So let's just place that at, let's say, 10 pixels by 10 pixels. And then I also need to give my rectangle a width and a height. Now I gave myself 300 pixels to draw in, so why don't I go ahead and draw out 250 pixels wide, and I'll just set up 150 pixels tall. Now we've actually drawn something into our canvas, but what we need to do is render it in order to be able to see it. So the very last step in our example here is to render this rectangle using a simple fill command. I'll go down here and I'll use my context again. This is where we do all of our drawing. And this time I'm going to call the fill function. We don't have to supply any parameters. The program simply looks for any shapes that we have drawn, which in this case would be the rectangle, and it'll fill them. Now we're ready to actually test this out and see what's going on. So I'm going to save my changes, and I'm going to go back out to my browser and refresh the page. And now you can see our rectangle has been drawn in that block area right down below here. Notice that the canvas itself is pretty much invisible, but we can set things up so we can see it by just adding a little style to it itself. So let me go back to our document, and I'm going to go right up here in the top, and I'm going to set up a style specifically for the test canvas ID. I'll use # for my ID selector, and we'll put in the name test canvas. I'll add some braces, and we'll just add a very simple border style so we can see the edge of our canvas. I'll put in here border. And we'll use the shortcut property for this one. So I just need to specify the border width, the border style, and the border color. So let's set it up to a simple border of 1 pixel. We'll go with solid, and we'll just make it black. Let's save that change. And if we go back out to our browser and refresh the page, now we can see the extents of that invisible canvas, and we can see the drawing item that we placed on it. Now, it may not seem important now to be able to draw graphics like this, but when we start working more and more in the mobile environment, the fewer images we have to actually send out to that mobile client, the better. In this case, we're creating graphics from simple text, our JavaScript and our HTML. And our graphics are going to be much, much smaller than any kind of JPEG that you could create. Now, of course, we're going to be looking at drawing more graphics than just black squares, but even in this first simple example, we can see how powerful it is to make graphics just from JavaScript and HTML.